And again, welcome everybody. I'm pleased to introduce Shaun Chamberlin. I met Shaun Chamberlin just a few months ago in November 2025 at the last Rev 21 event. Shaun has created and maintains an incredibly beneficial online platform that provides several different courseworks. One is self-paced, and the other is with a cohort of humans who are connected in their searching for a path through our times and finding interconnection with each other. I've gained many friends through my connection with Shaun, and that is why I'm here today and why I'm honored to introduce you to Shaun Chamberlin. Shaun, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Greg. And yeah, since we're a small group, we don't need to be too formal. So, if there's anything that comes up on your minds while I'm talking, then feel free to put them in the chat and we can I'm quite interruptible and flexible. But I've got some slides for us to look at. So let me pull this up and I'll talk for maybe 15, 20 minutes just to give you all a sense of who I am and what I'm doing here. But then we'll take it into more of a kind of workshop around exploring, yeah, different aspects of finding your personal path through times of collapse and how people might go about that. But let me share my screen here. Put this on. There we go. Um, So yeah, firstly, I might just explain why I've got here the date as 2026. And that's because I find the deep time perspective to be one that's very helpful, as we might talk about later, depending on your interests. And so Homo sapiens has been around roughly 200,000 years. And I think it helps us to take a longer view of things if our date systems don't pretend that we've only been around for 2000. Um, But really, yeah, our topic here is what on earth it makes sense to do in these times. And yeah, I guess that's a question we've all been grappling with. So I'll say a little about, um, yeah, my own journey and I guess why Rev 21 invited me to close things out today. So I'm imagining that there's nobody here that I need to talk to about the unsustainability of our current path. But I think one thing that's often missed about that is that radical change is inevitable. We either change direction or we end up where we're headed. And neither of those look like today. And I think very often when we're thinking about the future, we think, well, do I want it to be like it is or do I want it to change in this way or that way? And that is not the question of our times. We either change direction, radical change, or we end up where we're headed, radical change. And in that context, for me, it was around the turn of the millennium that I, at the time, was really grappling with things like climate destabilization and energy resource depletion, and kind of in my spare time. But I got to the point where so I was working at a project running a learning center for marginalized groups, drug misusers, people with mental health issues, young asylum seekers. And I loved that work, but I got to the point where I felt like I'm helping people to reintegrate with society, and society itself is charging off a cliff, and I want to engage with that somehow. But I didn't really have any sense of what that might look like. I didn't have any peer group around this. I didn't really know how to do that. And the key for me at the time was really minimizing my dependence on money, learning to live as cheaply as I could. I moved back in with my mum at the time, and all of these ways that I learned to minimize my dependence on money allowed me to basically quit that job and be like, okay, I've got enough savings that I could probably live for a year or so on my savings and give my time to what I'm fascinated by rather than having to sell it. And so, I read a lot. I harassed interesting seeming people. I went to events. And after about a year of this, I went to a place called Schumacher College. I heard about, I think, a 2-week course they were running there called Life After Oil. And many of the authors that had sort of impressed me in my reading um, were going to be teaching there. But I guess I also don't want to gloss over what a difficult year that was. How my peers were really, really asking me what on earth I was doing. Like, what was my career plan? What was I thinking? What was going on? And not really having any answers, just knowing that the default answers felt profoundly unsatisfactory to me. So I felt this urge to explore something else. And I think that willingness to step outside of the story that's laid out for us and step into that really uncomfortable space between stories, what I now would call the fertile void, I think is a key life skill for these times, actually. But yeah, I went to Schumacher College for this 2-week course, and very short story there, I met David Fleming. And this was one line of his that he said to us there: large scale problems do not require large scale solutions. They require small scale solutions within a large scale framework. And that kind of brought me up short at the time because I was thinking, oh, maybe I should go and get involved with the United Nations kind of climate negotiations and that kind of stuff. Maybe that's the most important place I can be. But I really saw the truth in this, that there are real problems with large scale solutions, that they don't deal with the diversity of things on the ground. And so David shifted something in me and essentially became a mentor for me over the 5 remaining years of his life. I also got involved there with what would become the Transition Towns movement. So this is like the mid 2000s. Was a co-founder of Transition Kingston. That's me there in the middle at the back. Um, I got involved with David Fleming in kind of working on climate and energy policy, like lobbying governments to implement energy rationing. Um, I was very involved with a lot of direct action. I mean, this is actually from Extinction Rebellion, which I would argue isn't direct action, but that's another story. Um, but yeah, I was sort of lobbying governments during the week, and then going out and yeah, doing ecological direct action at weekends. Um, and then after a couple more years, uh, got involved with setting up this thing called the Ecological Land Cooperative, which now has 7 sites across the UK, managing a couple of 100 acres. That are basically ways of helping people get onto the land and overcome the barriers to that, which are both, the price of land and the planning permission system. And almost all of this was unpaid because, again, what had allowed me to do things that really interested me and seemed worthwhile to me was living very cheaply. David managed to pay me a little for my work with him. But also, all of these things were manifestations of that principle, small scale solutions within large scale frameworks. So, transition towns is not, here's a thing that everyone should do. It's a set of tools for local communities to figure out themselves what kind of future they want to create for themselves. The land cooperative is not, here's what you should do on your land. It's, here's a framework within which you can gain access to land to do all the diverse things that the diverse land spaces need. And then in 2010, my aforementioned mentor David Fleming died very suddenly. And after his death, I brought his life's work, Lean Logic, to publication and edited out from it this paperback, Surviving the Future. And for me, reading, so when David was alive, although we worked extremely closely, he wouldn't let me look at the manuscript of his sort of life's work because he said we were too close, and if I was critical of it, we'd fall out, and he didn't want us to fall out. Um, and after his death, I was involved with sort of cleaning out his house and sorting out his belongings and stuff, and I found the manuscript for Lean Logic, and I figured I was allowed to read it at this point. Um, and actually, it was an astonishing read. It really made clear to me as a writer. I'd published my first book by this point on the transition movement. Um, this book was something much better than I could write at this point in my life. And also because David was such a dear friend to me, a friend said to me that the best way we can honor people we love after they die is to keep alive what was best in them in the world through our own life. And so for those reasons, it became clear to me that I wanted to bring the big book and ultimately both books to publication. But also because by that point, for me, political work or policy work had started to feel a bit futile because it seemed to me that the political context for ecologically sane policy was just not present. And, we could bang our head against that wall for decades, and indeed David had done that. Um, but really, yeah, I'd come by this point, sort of about 15 years ago, to feel like these are not problems that we face. These are predicaments. Like the fact that we're all going to die, it's not a problem to solve. It's a predicament to come to terms with. And so it seemed to me important actually to step back from policy work because that had become for me kind of the easy choice. Like I kind of knew how to operate in that world. Um, but I didn't really believe anymore that it was getting us anywhere. There was a line from a Leonard Cohen song actually that really buried in my soul around that time, which was they sentenced me to 30 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within. And I could see those 30 years stretching out in front of me. Um, and so then the question for me became, and I think this is still the question that guides me, if the predicament we face isn't going to be solved and society isn't going to voluntarily change, well, then what? And specifically, what does it look like in that context to find a path which feels neither like denial, just pretending that these things aren't happening, nor despair? And that's really been the question that's guided everything I've done since. And one of the guests on the Surviving the Future program that Craig mentioned earlier, Eve Anika, said this a few years ago: our fundamental crisis is a crisis in ways of relating. And that's really landed in me as well. And not just relating between humans, but how we relate to stories and meaning and non-humans and the environment as a whole. Um, and this image I kind of love because for me, it captures what it can be when we encounter something in these times which feels true and beautiful. And I don't know in your life what the example or examples of that would be, but I very much hope that we've all had that experience of encountering someone or something that just makes us go, wow, this still exists, even despite all the context that I'm sure everyone here knows about. This still exists. And that kind of, again, has become a motivation point for me. Like, I want to be one of those things. I want to be one of those things that people encounter and are refreshed by. And this is the home of my friend Mark Boyle, who has been one of those things for me. We first met when he'd given up money for 3 years because he felt that money was the root of so much evil, and what would it be like to just cut it from his life? He's now given up electricity because nobody can tell him how you make a solar panel without making an industrial society, and nobody can tell him how you make an industrial society without devastating our home world. And so together we are co-owners, along with four others, of this place, the Happy Pig, which is a free hostel out in Ireland, and clearly not a solution to the world's problems, but nonetheless a place where we can come together and honestly discuss together how it makes sense to live in the context of problems that we can't solve, and something that, again, it feels like a path which is not a path of despair, nor a path of denial, but a path of, okay, if we don't have the answers, let's stop pretending we have the answers and come together and discuss how it means to be in these times. Because I think, having been an activist for decades and been around activists for decades, very often we tell stories which are stories of kind of brave, futile defeat. We stood up for what we believed in, even though eventually we were crushed. And there's a lot to be said for that. But I think it encourages this, well, this sense of futility, this sense that there's this great kind of leviathan of the mainstream, which is killing everything, which is true, um, and that any kind of resistance to that, any kind of opposition to that is just, we're so small, how could we possibly do anything? And I think that story is misguided in an important way, which is that Leviathan is falling. The fact that it's unsustainable, nobody really disagrees with. But the obvious, by definition, implication of that it's going to end, somehow kind of falls by the wayside. And so, for me, the work of today, in a myriad of different ways, is building the sequels to that which is crumbling, that which we've been taught to find our security in, many of us. And so it's frightening and it's incredibly damaging as it crumbles, but nonetheless, what do the sequels look like? And one line from Howard Zinn also that I carry close to my heart is that when you encounter that plant growing through the tarmac, when you encounter something that seems beautiful, he recommends a heartening multiplication, which is that the media are probably not going to tell you about these things. And so for every one you encounter, you can probably safely assume there are another 50 out there that you don't know about. And that's really been my experience as I've kind of lived into alternative pathways, is that you encounter so many others that are kind of invisible to the mainstream networks. Um, so yeah, that's about all I'll say about myself and my path to date for now, unless you ask me more. Um, Surviving the Future, which Craig mentioned, is this online network that we've built, which is, if you like, an online equivalent to the Happy Pig. It's a place where people can come together for free online. We have meetings happening almost every day, um, and yeah, a place of global solidarity and active community. And I just love this that someone shared on social media. I remember sitting in history thinking, if I was alive then, I would have. Well, you're alive now. Whatever you're doing is probably what you would have done. And I'll end with this line from my favorite writer, Wendell Berry: protest that endures, I think, is moved by a hope far more modest than that of public success, namely the hope of preserving qualities in one's own heart and spirit that would be destroyed by acquiescence. And that's what I probably tried to say, much less beautifully, with finding that pathway between denial and despair. Um, so yeah, there are some links if anyone wants to learn more about some of the things that I've spoken to. And I see that Craig has been sharing some of those as well. But what I would like to suggest now is that we get a bit more interactive. So maybe we'll just take. So when I host film screenings in person, which by the way I find a fantastic way of finding the others locally where you are, put a film screening on about something that speaks to the topics that you're concerned about. See who turns up, but before the film, invite the person to turn to the person sitting next to them who they don't know and just talk for 5 minutes about why they're here. And then, in my experience, in my cultural contexts, when the film ends, they quite naturally turn back to each other and start talking again. And then you offer some refreshments, and anyone wants to stick around, and suddenly you've found some other people locally. And so I'm going to try and do the equivalent to that here. So we're going to just go into little breakout rooms of 2 or 3 people, and just for 5 minutes, the invitation is to yeah, just say what's brought you to either Rev 21, either to the Festival of Revolutions or to this particular talk. And then we'll come back in 5 minutes' time, and well, we'll see whether we want to do more small scale conversation like that, or whether we want to just have a more kind of plenary Q&A type discussion. I don't know if there's anyone who wants to say or ask anything beforehand, then by all means do so. But otherwise, I'll get the rooms open. So you should have an invitation on your screen, hopefully.
So Sean, you're doing the breakout rooms or did you want one of us to do
Yeah,
it?
yeah, I've set them up.
Okay.
I've just hit open, and hopefully people are getting that invite. Maybe you can, if anyone, maybe you can stick in this room for a minute, and if anyone uh, is having trouble, you can just check whether they're getting where they want to be. And maybe I'll see if there are any rooms that only one person's ended up in and go and join them. Let me go join Alex. So yeah, maybe are you still there, Craig? No, you've already joined a room. Alex. Welcome back, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed a little socializing. Um, so yeah, any questions or themes or comments that came out of that are welcome, but also we could do more of that if you like. We could have more small scale conversations if that floated your boat, or we can stay as a big group. So any and all opinions, questions, etc. Welcome. David.
One of my compatriots in the tiny group told a fantastic story just in the briefest way. They said that they used to be a sociopathic, very rich person, and at a certain point, they gave it all up. And that's when they found happiness. And that's when they met their life partner. And I just want to say, good for you. And
Yeah.
that's all.
But anything else anyone feels moved to share from the last 5 minutes? Or for that matter, anything that anyone's really grappling with in their life. Sergey, was that a unmuting of purpose
Yeah,
there?
thanks for noticing that, Sean. Yeah, I really appreciated the brief time one-on-one in this case, which I think in retrospect is an example maybe of this smaller scale. Uh, just two people met for the first time, sharing our stories, and yeah, really appreciated that. Thank you.
So yeah, I'm assuming that everybody here is completely clear about their path through these times and has made complete peace with all elements of the current predicament, and all is well. So I guess we can finish early. But if I miss my mark with anybody, then yeah, it would be interesting to hear where you're at. Carl?
So I've listened to a couple sessions today and very inspiring. The one thing that seems to keep coming up is so those of us um, in this community, in these communities, um, we kind of know what we should be doing, but the thing that always comes back to for me is how do we get the rest of the world to come along? How do we get those in power to give up that power? I mean, here in the US, my opinion are we have an absolute catastrophe of an administration. So, and I feel like they're holding on even more so to the kind of gross, unfettered capitalism. And and yes, I know one answer is to get more of us involved in this so that we become a majority. But in the meantime, like how do you even get started? And yes, have small conversations even with those that don't necessarily subscribe to your same ideas, whether they're political or otherwise. I understand all that, but it just seems like that is such an evolutionary thing, and it would take a long time. And I just turned 60, and I don't have forever, you know? I mean, yes, I also want to leave the world a better place, not just for myself, but for my kids and grandkids. I don't know. That's the part I'm struggling with. Like, how
Mm,
do we how do we move on and deal with the current system?
right. Yeah, I think that's the part many of us are struggling with. Um, and I suppose, that was why I got very involved with with kind of policy. I was like, okay, maybe we can change the rules and incentives of the system so that, we encourage more people in that direction, and that those with the wealth and power are kind of driven that way. And honestly, this is my perspective. Um, what I learned from a decade or so of that work was how profoundly wedded our current dominant systems of power are to economic growth, economically, politically, socially, culturally. Um, how many of the markers of the culturally accepted markers of success pretty much require engagement with that game. I mean, um, systems thinkers often talk about how when they're invited to look at a system and suggest how the outcomes they're heading towards might change, is that they can often identify this one leverage point. And what they find is that everyone in that organization is already pushing at that same lever already, but in completely the wrong direction. And I think that's really the case with our kind of global society. Like, growth is an incredible leverage point, and this is how governments measure their success. Our economy grew by this much. And you don't need to know too much about the arithmetic of growth to realize how problematic that is. That something innocuous sounding like 3.5% growth uh, means a doubling in 20 years, means a doubling in economic activity in 20 years. And the idea of taking something that's so world consuming as the global economy right now and doubling it in size is as insane as it sounds. And so really, I have come to the point, and David Fleming's work comes to the point, that there is not an answer that you're going to like to your question, Carl. That what we have is a system that's wedded to exactly the thing that will destroy it. And so, which not everyone does, and I don't necessarily recommend that everyone does, but if you do, as I do, accept that we're not able to head off that runaway train, I have to share. Fritz Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful, shared this anecdote of going to the Soviet Union. Um, and he said in the Soviet Union, they look at the American economy and they think it's crazy. It's like a locomotive that's charging off a cliff, but by God, we will overtake it. And yeah, this is the madness that we're living in. And so for me and for David and for the people with whom I find common cause, the question has become no longer how do we head off this crazy system, but rather how do we prepare for the point where the system continues to run into the limits of its own sustainability and crash at its own hands. And it would certainly be vastly better to be thinking about managed descent. Um, but I no longer believe that that will happen. And consequently, I no longer find it um, enlivening to bang my head against that wall. But what does seem meaningful to me is preparing. I mean, it seems to me that collapse is already unfolding in so many places around the world and for so many species around the world. And it's only people in the sort of shrinking circles of affluence who still get to sit around and talk about it as some kind of future possibility. And so yeah, for me, I guess the question, the next difficult question becomes, yeah, what does it look like if we don't manage to do that? And what does it mean to live beautiful lives in that context? Because I genuinely, my work goes under this name of dark optimism, and I genuinely believe there's nothing about these incredibly challenging times that stops us from telling stories we believe in with our days. And in many ways, that's all any of us could ever ask. You know, read books like Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who literally lived through as a Jew through the Nazi concentration camps of Dachau and Auschwitz, and suddenly the idea that these times are too dark and too despairing to even face, I don't know, started to feel a bit embarrassing to me. Um, yeah.
But I
So
mean,
I don't
even
think I
passing
have.
that on to our kids. Sorry to talk. I mean,
No,
talk
go
over
ahead,
you.
Carl. I was
But
just about to ask.
so like I know Craig very well. I know him personally. We both have kids that are teens, 20s, and
Hmm.
even just getting our own kids into this. I mean, I grew up in a household of scientists, and so there was very much a meritocracy, right? You have to get a degree so you can get a good job, so you can make a lot of money, so you can have a good house, whatever life for your family. But and I went through all that and I succeeded in those terms. But now I'm looking at my own kids and I'm thinking, well, we got them to go to college and, do the things that they're supposed to do in this society. But now I'm thinking maybe I should be teaching them how to grow a garden and all these things, but they're not necessarily very accepting of these things because they also grew up with the trappings of modernity. They like their frappa ding dongs from Starbucks, and it's going to be hard to give that up even at their age. So, yeah, I mean, we have to start in our own houses, our own households, and even that seems to be a challenge.
It sure is. Um, I mean, I would say there are more and more people who um, see things in these kinds of ways. And like you, my experience when I tried to go and, grab people by the shoulders and say, "Hey," it was not very successful. But when I have instead walked a path that I love in response to these things, then I've found that people are coming to me and saying, "Hey, like you actually seem much more positive than anyone I know who's living much more mainstream stories of success. Like what's going on there?" And like people come and start the conversations. And also for me, when I first launched my Dark Optimism website, which I think was maybe 2003 or so, it was just a little blog. But I remember, friends of mine who I would never have dreamt of trying to talk to about this stuff would be like, "Oh, I looked you up online and I found your website," and they would start those conversations. And so I think although it's hard when it's, your own family, um, I find it's much more effective to have the conversations with the people who are ready to have them and do beautiful things with those people. And then, other people are like, "Hey, how come you guys are having all the fun?" But yeah, I don't have a magic wand for getting your kids to overcome all their cultural conditioning, sadly. Um, but yeah, Alberto and then Remy, I think you've been waiting all
I
night.
actually, I would just want to ask Alberto, do you want to add another point, or would you like to answer or react to what is being discussed now?
No, I guess another point.
Could I then maybe jump just
Yeah,
to?
and I'll just say
Sure.
on that, Remy, that or
Mhm.
Remy, I'm not sure, but this is a useful symbol that we sometimes
Oh
use.
yeah, 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 yeah.
So, like for everyone else, that means I have a direct response, and it's kind of queue jump, but it involves a certain responsibility because obviously, if you just use
Mm.
it to jump the queue and then say something completely different, then everyone's going to get fed up. But yeah, Remy, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I was just thinking that also, I don't know, for me, maybe it's not also necessarily like choosing, right, between either trying to change the path of like on which we are or preparing for the impact. Like that, oftentimes some activities can do both, right? When we are like building solidarity networks and building community, right, that changes the cultural and also the organizational aspects of our society that need to change, in the order to, for example, yeah, like stop the addiction, right, or the dependency on growth,
Yeah,
and to like move away from capitalism. But at the same time, we are also by that preparing um, these networks for when everything is collapsing, that there will be much less suffering and there will be much more opportunity for us maybe to kind of, I don't know, like get again on our knees and or on our legs, because we can hold each other with these solidarity networks. I don't know. Yeah, that's something that like I was also like thinking like, okay, why should I put so much energy when it's going to shit? But then yeah, we can still like create these seeds that will allow us to survive the fire in a way. Yeah, I don't know if it
100%.
makes sense.
Yeah, beautifully said. Um, yeah, the way I sometimes frame it is like I mean I was a climate activist for 15 years. But now if someone said to me, "Hey, do you want to put the next few years of your life into reducing the emissions of this process by 15%?" I have no interest in that whatsoever because it seems to me that only makes sense in the context of some cultural turning that I don't think is going to happen. But as you say, there are many, many paths that make sense across a diversity of futures. In fact, I think that's a better definition of resilience than most people use. Like a lot of people seem to think resilience is like correctly anticipating the future and preparing for it. Um, I do not think that. I think that resilience is choosing a path that makes sense across the widest possible range of possible futures. And as Remy said, like building community, building solidarity is the definition of that. And maybe the other strand to that is that on our first Surviving the Future program back in 2020, one of our participants was from Venezuela, and she was talking about, collapse for her is like lived reality now, and it was sort of disorienting for her to hear people talking about it as hypothetical future thing, and it was almost like William Gibson said, the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And so the beauty of kind of talking to people in different places is you almost get to time travel. Oh, you're living in my future. Oh, you're living in my past in these different ways. But what really stuck with me from Marcella's sort of testimony was that she'd always imagined that when things kind of fell apart as they had done in her homeland, that people would sort of wake up and be like, "Oh, what have we done? We've been crazy, right? We have to get back to some kind of sanity." And actually, she said what she saw around her was people were like, "How do we get Coca-Cola back in the supermarkets again? How do we get normal back?" Because their sense of normal had only had a time span of, decades. And so the other thing I would sit alongside Remy, like community and solidarity, is building together new stories so that when the existing dominant stories crumble, we have something to replace them with instead of just trying to get the recent normal back again. And I see you're wearing a degrowth shirt, so I imagine that's very much along your lines. But yeah, basically just yes and thank you. Alberto, I see we've got a few hands up. So
Yeah. No, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that there's a lot of criticism coming from people outside of these circles, saying, "Oh, um, can you just stop talking about these problems and start acting? Stop, waving flags and stop doing kumbayas and actually go and do something." But they never specify what that something is. If I find that thrown about a lot, especially on talk shows on TV. But um, yeah, I feel that talking about simply the act of talking about about these problems and the future that we face is conducive to so many beautiful things, right? I mean, look at this Festival of Revolutions. We got, hundreds of people together to discuss, and from those discussions, so many nice things could come about, right, in the future. Um, and so many things have been born out of discussions and just meeting kindred spirits and having debates and sharing of opinions. And all of this stuff is happening very much under the radar, right? Lots of what we talk about and what we organize and what we do is just not something that gets recorded in mainstream channels. So I feel like just by simply opening up a discussion with a like-minded person opens up like a realm of call it underworld, although that term is probably demeaning. But no, it's I feel it not a small investment of willingness can lead to many positive results, and it wasn't always the case. I mean, a lot of people are now more aware of this stuff and keen to do a lot about it. So
yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, well said. One of David Fleming, my late mentor's lines was, "Do nothing that matters without consulting a conversation." It would be strange to just act without thinking it through first. That would be quite dangerous in itself. And it would be probably wise to not just think it through oneself, but to talk to some people. Of course, there are dangers in just being a talking shop. But one of the lines I love, I've not yet been able to find out who first said it, but it's that it's far easier to act your way into new ways of thinking than to think your way into new ways of acting. So I do think there's a lot to be said for taking that step into some action, whether that's the action of coming to an event like this or organizing an event like this, or whatever it may be. But yeah, so there's something to be said for the criticism if we might be leaning towards being too much of a talking shop, but yeah, it's a balance, isn't it? We need both, and the talking absolutely can be the first step to the acting. Dario.
Yes, my observation is that most often when I failed in my life, it's because I failed for a target, to achieve a target. It's simply because I had a target and I defined it and I went for it. And I did that not in relationship to the environment, but to what I perceived the target to be. So for instance, the person that talked about trying to appeal to their children with Frangelico Starbucks. They'll never win, possibly, but they might win by developing a different meme, like a Bucky Fuller used to say, be a trim tab on the rudder of a ship. And so this tiny little trim tab moves tiny little space and it controls the entire movement of these huge ships or airplanes. So that's an example of having an idea and going with the idea without defining necessarily who the marketplace will be able to accept the idea. Similarly, I find that Gene Sharp had the greatest line I've ever heard, which is, "You never lose unless you give up." Think about that. You never lose unless you give up. So much of what we do is because we give up too soon, or we just give up. We just give up. So anyway, those are my observations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dario. And yeah, it's funny, like I mentioned my friend Mark, who lived without money and now lives without electricity, and part of his reasoning is shifting what some people call the Overton window, the window of what's acceptable discourse. And that, if he's the complete nutter out there, then maybe that lets someone else seem more reasonable. And that I'd never quite made the connection, but that feels a little trim tabbish, just like pulling the window this way and steering the ship of society somewhat. It's funny though, it's interesting that I'm feeling into that quote about quitting a lot, because I would say probably the main errors I've made in my life have been not quitting. That, like, sometimes, as you say, if you've chosen the wrong target, then refusing to quit in pursuit of it can be an error too. So yeah, as so often it's about that discernment, isn't it? Like noticing the subtle voice in us that maybe whispers when we're like, yes, I'm absolutely on the path. This feels like absolutely what I'm doing. I'm absolutely right where I want to be. And then maybe, I don't know, 2 years later, there's a little voice going, do I still believe in this? And you're like, no, I can't listen to that. Like, I finally found it. This is my thing. And that, yeah, bravery, I guess, to, yeah, be resolute and not quit in pursuit of the right goals, and to also admit when we maybe are realizing they're not the right goals. Yeah. Um, David.
Thank you. I'd like to query, I guess, David Fleming's formulation that You don't need large scale solutions. You need small scale solutions in a large scale framework.
Mm-hmm.
Have I stated that correctly?
Correctly enough, yeah.
So we here are engaged in developing many kinds of small scale solutions. And the question I have is, how does the large scale framework emerge? Or is it emergent, in fact, from the existence of the many small scale solutions? Or where does it come from? And also, we are confronting an existing large scale framework, which is inimical to life on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So, how does the large scale framework come to be, especially in the presence of this hostile existing framework? Thank you.
Great question. Love it. Well, firstly, it strikes me that the second part of your question is a sort of confirmation of the premise that, you know, if the devastation that we're facing is being caused by a large scale framework, that confirms the potency of such frameworks and how they can shape. You know, if your aim is economic growth and capitalism is your framework, then it's creating an incredible diversity of small scale solutions in pursuit of that aim. Um, and uh, and so I think, really, as I understand that maxim from David Fleming, uh, it's a strategic comment. So it's saying, rather than uh, seeking to address the problem within the current framework, to go, okay, you know, we've got capitalism, we can't do anything about that, but we've got this pollution issue, so let's figure out a large scale solution to pollution, for example. Instead, what we need to do is challenge the framework. What we need to do is figure out. So, like, as I mentioned in my life, rather than just it's led me, like, I've personally felt called to the work of the framework building. Um, and so Transition Towns is a framework that exists to encourage and support a whole diversity of local community responses to collapse, for shorthand. Um, as I said, the Ecological Land Cooperative is a framework that enables and supports a diversity of people to get on the land and have that direct relationship with the land and let that be what it is. And so, and indeed, the Surviving the Future online programs are that as well. So for me, the question, it's not necessarily that you need a singular large scale framework. And indeed, I have seen people who've been quoting that from David Fleming tweak it slightly from what he wrote to large scale problems do not require large scale solutions. They require small scale solutions within large scale frameworks, plural. And I would go along with that. That isn't exactly what David wrote, but knowing David, I think that was probably more in line with what he meant. And so I personally don't think that we're looking for a large scale framework to replace capitalism or colonialism or whatever large scale framework we want to name, so much as looking for a world of many yeses. Like the Zapatistas talk about a world within which many worlds fit. So rather than having a global framework, to have a diversity of large scale frameworks. And if you get deeper into lean logic, you'll see that he writes about holons, which are, I mean, it's maybe getting a bit technical, but like that you have nested scales essentially. So you have large scale frameworks for the small scale frameworks below, and then you have large scale frameworks within which those are nested. And yeah, when we're looking for more than a pithy one-line sentence, I would say that what you're actually looking at is a nested holonic framework of frameworks. And those will look very diverse, and it's completely appropriate for those to be created by people and collectives at all different scales, rather than being coordinated top down, and having some like grand overarching framework that holds it all. I don't know. Does that prompt any follow-up thoughts, David? Or
Yes, no, it's that casts the that formulation as a strategy for resistance,
Mhm.
resistance to the existing large-scale framework, which claims utter dominance. There is no alternative. So the formulation is a strategy for resistance to the existing hegemony of the dominant framework. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. I'll also share from the UK that there is no alternative. Tina, which I think may have originated with our wonderful ex-Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Over here, we talk about taboo. There are billions of options. Um, yes, Alexander. Yes, we still have good time.
Thank you. So, Daryl and David already touched on the parts what I wanted to say or observe. So, I'm still not kind of ready to, in the sense to, maybe I'm too hopeful to kind of give up and say, like, we will definitely hit that iceberg. And I'm always repeating, fight is not over until it is over. So in that sense, like keep fighting. But my reason for coming to all these Rev meetings is because I know deep down, and I wrote in my books, solutions exist, and like it is possible to transit very quickly. Money is not the problem. Technology is not the problem. We currently, at this day and age, and today, we have everything we need to quickly transit and solve all these issues. Like I can't guarantee for the many political things, but I can guarantee for the global warming. Well, AMOC, it's a different kind of beast. But what I'm kind of constantly finding, it's like I had like a long term learning curve, finding kind of different solution, what needs to be changed, and always finding something new and finally coming and always the end problem is like people in the sense why I'm coming here is I don't know, maybe lack of the salesman skills or feminine energy or like uh, emotional intelligence, but like people here are giving me different angles I never considered, and I find that beautiful because like last uh, last wall which is left is how to break the vested interest of those at the top, because that vested interest they have they can replace with a different thing. Instead of fossils, with the renewables they will still continue to earn. So just convincing them how to break that little thing in like their mindset, so they will not be a wall which kind of prevent us to do the thing which is necessary to do. So that's my question. Like last wall, how to influence those people who are holding gates of the policy. Like it will take a bit longer to give you a real example from the governments I was communicating with to understand what I'm trying to get to. But just imagine that you are offering someone, I will save you millions and billions, and they're saying, no, no, our trajectory is 2045. And I'm saying we can do it in 2030 and you will save. So how to do that? That's my question for everyone.
Hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Um, yeah, this is getting into the juicy stuff, and I before I answer, I just want to say like I really honor that approach of I'm going to go to a place where people maybe have a really different perspective, and I'm just going to learn from that and be fertilized by that, and yeah, that's I admire that, and I admire the fight's not over till it's over attitude, the not quitting that Daryl talked about, which is, I guess, why I talk about telling a story that we believe in with our days, because that story might be, well, I just never gave up. I just continued trying to get some kind of sanity there, and even if hypothetically I couldn't, get that through to the necessary power folk. I'm still proud to have done that. I'm still proud to have borne witness to that possibility, and yeah, all power to that. Um, and I think you've kind of hinted there, like, I would agree with you in terms of uh, certain very desirable outcomes, like everything that we need is there in terms of, technological possibilities and time, and yeah, so much could be done better. Um, and so the question then becomes, as you've asked it, how do we get through the politics, or kind of upstream of the politics? How do we change the culture enough that the politics changes enough that decisions can reflect this? Which in many ways comes back to Carl's question, I think, from the kind of from the start of this session. And I know some really wonderful people who are trying to work at this level. I mean, many of you may be familiar with the work of Nate Hagans, who's been a friend of mine for over 20 years. And, he is being approached by people with a lot of power and influence, and having conversations about, should we be doing things wildly differently? And um, I'm glad that he's doing what he's doing. At the same time, um, as Remy's hinted in the chat there, it seems to me that there isn't, well, you're talking about a very specific thing. I would say in terms of the overall trajectory of our um, omnicidal economic system, I don't think there's any individual or small group of individuals who have the power to redirect it all. It's like a system that has its own momentum to the point where anyone who goes against it gets outcompeted and crushed, and sort of everybody feels powerless. And I've spoken with several members of the British Parliament, for example, who are like, "Yeah, the whole system's completely insane," and I'm like, but you're the ones who are running that system," and they're like, "Yeah, but I can't change it." And so there is this sort of strange. There's an amazing movie called Cube Zero that gets into all this strange thing where it's become sort of self-perpetuating. And so I would have to say, unfortunately, Alexander, that I do not have an answer, and having pursued that answer myself for a long time, I'm no longer convinced. Well, I suppose the question is, as activists often put it, what is our theory of change? And my theory of change has shifted from, getting the right people to wake up and implement the solutions that exist, to, well, my theory of change is that it's all going to change because it's wildly unsustainable and it's going to come crashing down. And there are important preparations that we can do for that, because most people aren't operating in that mindset, which gives us a kind of first mover advantage. And on a personal level, as I say, like, I have so much solidarity with the fight not over till it's over approach. And for me, I feel, in order to feel wholehearted in my path, I have to also allow for the possibility that we lose that fight. And so, as I think Remy was kind of mentioning earlier, um, the work that makes sense to me in these times currently is work where I feel like if there is some great cultural turning to sanity, then I've played my part in that. But if there isn't, everything I'm doing still makes some kind of sense, still offers some kind of benefit, and both of those are kind of, yeah, necessary to my path. I don't know, Alexander, if you want to come back and say anything in response to that, because I'm aware I haven't given you the magic answer you're seeking, but you probably didn't expect me to.
Well, like I accept the answer. Or I didn't expect to give me immediately, but thing is, like, I don't accept the notion of accepting to lose the fight, in the sense because casualties are too big for me to accept. It's losing maybe total casualties. We don't know. Like in the case of runaway global warming, we don't know what can happen because historically we know that at one point human civilization has dropped to just 1,000 members.
Hmm.
Like that's a historical fact. Like I don't know, was it Ice Age or what was it? But yeah, like yeah, that's it. So sorry, give the chance other people.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I would just say again, I mean, as a long-time climate activist, like I so respect the perspective of, you know, if if we can head off runaway climate change, that's more important than anything. And if it is doable, we're the only generation who can do it. And so, you know, I am humble enough to see real solidarity with people who are refusing to give up on that possibility, while at the same time, personally, having come to the perspective of being convinced that that isn't a fight that we're going to win, and so I can no longer, yeah, no longer vote it wholeheartedly. Um, so yeah, all power to you. And if you find that magic leverage stick for convincing people to actually implement solutions, then contact me and I'll be right behind you all the way because boy do we need it. But yeah, I mean we're nearly at time now, so let's take
Thank
Dariel
you.
and Chang Li and then we'll look at wrapping up. Dariel.
I think the important thing is to remember that we have time on our side because we are in total collapse. In the United States, it is like so obvious that you can't count it. My partner has trained, her groups have trained over 1 million people in civil resistance. They've done 50,000 very intensively, 10,000 like super intensively. So we're fighting back against the system eating everybody in the world, but there's no chance that there's no certainty that we'll win. So our time is on our line. It's like, do we lose 100 million people? Do we lose a bill? That's like World War II. Do we lose 1 billion people, 2 billion people? It's all there, but as it collapses, it creates a world of opportunity to move into to create change. That's my thoughts.
Well said. And also, Dariel, yeah, it's a pleasure to connect. I've heard some of your story elsewhere, so good to connect with you. Um, Chang Li, I think it is.
Yeah. May I ask, so in 35 years, in 38 years, there's a new report last month, I think, a few weeks back, talking about the total collapse of Atlantic ocean quantity of water and life
Hmm.
and temperature of the water. That means it's going to be the winter in UK is going to be so bad that we might just freeze to death and all that kind of thing. So, what is in your view of preparation, that would be like?
Mm. So this is the AMOC that Alexander was referencing before, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, I think.
Yeah,
Um, and yeah, this is a story as someone who lives in Ireland and England. I've been following quite closely for quite a number of years. Um, and yeah, I haven't studied in depth this latest report. I've only read the headlines, but there's yeah, new evidence. I mean, it's all probabilistic, but there's new evidence that that the collapse of that could be more imminent than expected, or than previously expected. And so essentially, these islands are warmed by a current that runs across the Atlantic and means that we're considerably warmer than other places that are on the same latitude, and that could end or potentially even go into reverse slightly. And so, yeah, preparation for that is extremely difficult, and is not maybe as difficult as something like, oh, I'll just refresh my video because I see I've gone blurry. Not maybe as difficult as preparing for, say, nuclear winter, which, a lot of people have also tried to work out. But there are an awful lot of, well, yeah, apocalyptic possibilities that that are out there. And again, I would come back to kind of what Romy was saying, that for me, the key preparation that makes sense is collective. David here is involved with an organization or a movement called Solidarity Prepping. Um, and, that makes so much sense to me, that, preparation is not just a thing that we approach as individuals or as families, but it's a question of like, how do we build the resilience of our communities? How do we build the resilience of our ecosystems? Because ultimately, thinking only about humans is a strategy with a poor survival outcome. And so again, as I said before, for me, the appropriate definition of resilience is doing things that make sense across the widest possible range of possible futures. And I think for people on these islands, bearing in mind that potential dramatic shift in our climate in the coming decades is part of that. I would say it would be a mistake to attach undue certainty to the timescale of these things and prepare only for that. And so for me at present, what that looks like is building awareness, building solidarity, building the kinds of networks that we're doing here through Rev 21, through solidarity prepping, through deep adaptation, through collapse camp, through all these networks that are coming together. Because then, as these things develop, as the science becomes clearer about how they're developing, as the consequences start to come to bear, we have these networks of solidarity that are able to respond, and are, crucially, as I mentioned earlier, are able to tell stories about what we're aiming for that are not just how do we get McDonald's, how do we get Coca-Cola back in the supermarkets again. So in many ways, I see our work as being the work of culture seeders. We're doing the work together of building alternative narratives that can hold people as the mainstream narratives make sense to fewer and fewer people. Um, and so, yeah, for me, AMOC collapse is one of many existential threats that we face. Biodiversity
So
collapse as it unfolds. So yeah, Chang-Li, come back in.
we are preparing for what come after the end. So the society after,
Yeah, you
or
could say that.
in the process, how to.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, for me, we're often trained by Hollywood to think of collapse as being an event. Like one day this happens. In fact, there's a film called The Day After Tomorrow, isn't there, about sudden like freezing just happening overnight. I mean, nobody thinks that AMOC collapse will be like that within the scientific community. But yes, really, it's about um, actually David Fleming had a line that these kinds of epoch-defining changes are in a sense like a wave. You can't steer them, but you can ride them. And
So
so, yeah,
I guess it would be similar to during the Black Death, how the medieval church collected, treated the illness, and then tried to collect resources and share that around as a community, and really trying to save, well, trying to give the dead some dignity, but at the same time give the chance of survival to the people. For example, food back then would be a communal thing. So the church would have taken the sickness, feed them and clean them, but also try to, separate them and try to save who can save them and prepare death for whoever. I'm interested because in history, back in medieval time, there was a thinking of living a good life and die a good death. But nowadays, we don't think about dying a good death because we're so scared of dying.
Totally. And I think death phobia is a huge issue in our culture. In fact, I would recommend, I'll put the link in the chat, a very short entry from that dictionary for the future and how to survive it that I mentioned on death is yeah, it's short and it's powerful because it's so contrary to um, modern ideas of death and dying. And in fact, I'm fascinated by the fact that the Stoics took the perspective that one should never pass up the opportunity of a good death. That many people don't get that chance, and you should never let it pass you by. And that's so contrary to modern kind of thinking that it fascinates me. And I would recommend, if you're not familiar with it, Chang Li, this book Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Andriotti, which is, as the name implies, kind of that work of providing hospice care to a dying set of cultural stories, a dying way of life, because it's
Sorry, may
incredibly
I ask you to
fascinating.
type it in chat because I can't quite
I shall.
made it
We'll
out.
do that while I bring in David, who I see has a direct point to make, and then we'll look at closing because we're a little over time. David.
Sorry.
You bring up the question of survival, and I think that's something we have a hard time looking at. Are we planning for survival? And what if we aren't? Does that render our lives meaningless? The answer is no, it doesn't render our lives meaningless. There are a variety of ways to approach the question of a good life in the context of a good death or a good collapse or whatever you want to say. My personal approach is spiritual. The advent of collapse has forced my perspective to change in a massive way. I look at the entire universe differently and myself. I've also learned recently, though, that even in the natural, normal world that we live in, that these conversations that we are having and these relationships that we are building, they are life. They are the value of life, regardless of what the future holds. And so the work that we do is for today. The future comes as it comes, it's not within our control. But working together and talking together, this is what life is, and this is what the beauty and value of it is. That's my approach to the questions of death and survival. It's like today, this conversation. Thank you.
Alberto?
Yeah, very quickly about the this collaboration and working together in this process of collapse that David just mentioned. I think that in the years I've been collapse aware, the level of conversation and the level of sort of sophistication and, let's say, completeness of initiatives that have built on top of each other has been has been accelerating and has been very significant. I wonder if you, Shaun, or David, had anything to say about that. If you agree or disagree with me. I feel like the movement's really growing in complexity and effectiveness.
I mean, massively. I mean, as I said, for me, my kind of uh, horrified wake up call to all of this was sort of 25 years ago now. And at that point, the only thing online really was this website called dioff.org, which is technically a term from oil fields, but the other meaning won't be lost on you all. And there really wasn't any kind of online community around it at all. And yeah, and it was really hard to find the others in person as well. So yeah, from my perspective, it's incredibly obvious how rapidly this kind of solidarity movement is growing under various sort of networked names, and happily also, I think, with a real sense of solidarity. Like I don't feel like there's any sort of rivalry between factions in a massive way there, just a lot of solidarity and different ways of presenting and talking about things. So yeah, which is, why it's such a pleasure to be here with the Rev 21 folk and as part of this wonderful event. And also, Alexander, I just wanted to mention, I flicked back through the chat, and Craig, I think, was asking for the name of your book. I think you mentioned you'd produced a book um, around the sort of solutions that you found, but I don't know whether it's published.
I can post the link
Yeah,
if you don't mind. Like usually
yeah,
I
please do.
don't help promote.
Yeah, that would be great.
So right with me.
Well, while we're waiting for Alexander to post that link in the chat, let's go ahead and pause the video and thank Shaun.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll just say, Craig, as a kind of final closing, that I think all this talk of giving up or not, and of quitting, and of choosing our targets, and of acting our ways into new ways of thinking, they're all different ways of really approaching what David said, the kind of spiritual question of, yeah, how does it make sense to live in these times? And so, above all, I would encourage, like, not that you do this particular thing, but would just encourage that discernment, that really listening in to the little voices inside you that maybe say, huh, maybe this path that I'm on is no longer the path that feels truest or most appropriate, or whatever language you want to use. Because I really have the sense that we each and all have access to that deep wisdom inside of ourselves. And I know there are some people on this call who've made some pretty dramatic changes to their lives in response to those kinds of insights. So yeah, make make the space and time to heed the things that maybe part of you is resisting. Um, Act your way into new ways of thinking, and yeah, reach out to the various communities that there are, that people have shared links to in the chat, and find the others. And yeah, we'll all get through this somehow. And by that, I don't mean that we'll all live forever, because we all know we're going to die, but we get to tell beautiful tales with our time while we're here. So thank you all for joining us. And yeah, Craig, if you want to wrap things up, it's been a joy, everyone.